Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Madison Oliver. Madison, thanks for being here.
Oh, of course. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I've been chasing you down, trying to chat with you for a while because you have a really interesting background and a lot of different roles and things you do within the community and the industry. But for folks that don't know you, haven't come across your content or cross paths with you, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you're up to at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with some historical context. So my first job out of grad school was actually at the Software Engineering Institute, doing vulnerability coordination at the CERT Coordination Center on behalf of the U.S. government. So I started interning there while I was in graduate school, and that was really my foray into vulnerability management, vulnerability response. What is this whole world of vulnerability coordination? So I started out, one of the first projects I worked on was actually triaging incoming bug bounty reports for the Hack the Pentagon program, which was very interesting. And I learned a wide breadth of vulnerability details. And that was really like a great headfirst dive, almost trial by fire, into learning and becoming familiar with a lot of these sort of topics. I did some embedded device vulnerability analysis while I was there, and coordinating at the CERT Coordination Center really gave me just such a breadth of knowledge and experience that I think I would have found very hard to get elsewhere. So I feel really like I learned a lot there, and it was also my first instance working at a CVE naming authority too, which is something that I'm actively doing quite a lot of these days as well. So I was at the CERT Coordination Center for maybe 4 or so years before I moved on to GitHub. So I first joined our product security incident response team for the first 7 or 8 months of my tenure at GitHub, and I've been here for just about 3 years now. My claim to fame in my time in PCERT is I was the co-lead incident response analyst for Log4Shell for GitHub, which was quite an adventurous time for the whole industry. After that, I moved over to our security lab, which is essentially our security research wing here at GitHub, and I manage our advisory database curation team. So GitHub runs an open source free product called our Advisory Database. It's a database filled with individual advisory information about open source vulnerabilities. And I manage the wonderful team of individuals who manage the content within that database.
Yeah, it's quite the mission given the outsized role that GitHub plays in the industry. I actually want to back up a little bit. I didn't know that about the PCERT and your role with GitHub during Log4Shell. Tell us a little bit about that experience. You're kind of new to the team, it sounds like, and then this big event happens that's impacting the whole ecosystem. Everyone's scrambling to see, where does it exist in the code base or the applications we're running, what vendors have it in their, products and so on. What was that like? What did that look like?
To be honest with you, for me, that's much more of my comfort zone, and it's probably because of the experience that I had while coordinating vulnerabilities at CERT, because our scale and scope there is extremely broad. So we were very deliberate in choosing what we would coordinate, and it typically was only things that reached that sort of international critical scale that ended up also being Log4Shell while I was at GitHub. So for me, it was like I was in my bread and butter. I felt very much at home, very high intense sort of type of work, which again is also why I maybe didn't do that for as long as I could have, because it is quite intense, and anybody who's worked in incident response will agree that it's very high burnout. But it was a particularly interesting incident to manage. And so my experience when I was at CERT is typically much more focused on closed source software. So I had familiarity and maybe some experience with open source at that point, but not nearly to the degree that I do now, especially in my role at GitHub. So seeing an incident of that scale from the other side, from the response side of things, and especially at the scale of open source, was really eye-opening for me. And it was honestly such a privilege to be able to see that and experience it in that way and be so close to the issue, because my experience at CERT was much more of I was the person telling you about these issues and demanding that you take some action or fix them, and I found myself on the other side of that coin being the one demanded to take some action and having to do the sort of things that I used to ask others to do. So I'll also say throughout that process, I gained quite a lot of empathy for everybody in the response and vulnerability management community. But it was a really interesting experience.
Yeah, I'm curious on that note, given the role that GitHub plays as like the largest developer platform in the world, basically, obviously you were looking around internally to say where is GitHub impacted, if at all, how does this impact our customers and so on. But I imagine there's probably a lot of interactions with GitHub customers as well, in terms of folks having code bases and applications and so on, source code on GitHub. How did that look in terms of the industry and reaching out to GitHub or asking for advice or, direction or guidance? Like, did that happen quite a bit as well?
Yeah, there was a significant amount of that at the time and afterwards, right? We've continued to release security guidance, security tooling, security, all of the things around this to help the community and progress from that too. So we're working on this, or worked on it, I'll say, from the advisory database side of things, because that is the back end of Dependabot alerts. So we use that as a function to encourage folks to update to non-vulnerable versions of packages like Log4j. So we do a lot of notification in that way, but we also do a lot of engagement with the community and a lot of support, both for our customers or really any users on GitHub, whether you pay us or a free user or not. We do a lot of engagement and outreach for them as well. So yeah, it was a lot of support internally at the time of the event, but also a lot of support afterwards externally with customers, with the community as a whole, and like how do we grow from this? How do we develop from this? And what do we do next time something like this happens? Because I think we all know at this point it's probably going to happen again.
Yeah, and I believe you're right. I think we all probably assume that's going to be the case. And I gotta say, I've been really impressed with the way that GitHub has been interacting with the community and trying to help, kind of lift the tide of the whole ecosystem when it comes to software supply chain security. They have a really unique position, and it's a great opportunity to kind of rise the tide of everyone who may not have capabilities or insight or expertise that the team at GitHub has. So it's been really cool to see. And I want to ask too, there's been a lot of, focus lately on vulnerability databases. Obviously, there's a lot of drama with the NVD and the, slowdown and enriching of CVEs and so on. But there's been a lot of interest in terms of the broader vulnerability database ecosystem. You have your team at the GitHub Advisory Database. You also have OSS Index, OSV. There's a lot of players out there. How do you all at GitHub see how you fit into that ecosystem and, what maybe makes you, a better option than some of the others, or like how you collaborate with some of the others? How do you guys think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm personally a huge proponent of community and collaboration anytime that I can. So our scope within the advisory database is a set number of ecosystems that we support, which loosely tie to package registries and specifically open source package registries. So we try to engage closely with those communities that we do support, and we're very deliberate in that. So we'll engage with folks at the Python Software Foundation, at OpenJS, at any of the foundations for the large ecosystems that we work with, any of the major projects or packages in those ecosystems, any of the, and also not major ones too, right? I am happy to help collaborate and coordinate with a package that is having difficulties of any size, right? Whether it's criticality or not, right? I really just want to help to bring up the bar, and I know that includes those on the tail end and those on the forefront as well. So the mission of the GitHub Security Lab is to find vulnerabilities, educate the community, amplify our security research, but also notify the ecosystem. And this is really where my team starts to fit in. So the mission of the GitHub Advisory Database is really a future where no human's impacted by a security breach because of an upstream dependency due to lack of information. We're truly trying to address or fix that first issue of, do you even know about this issue at all in the first place? So really about the notification. So when it comes to other advisory databases, I think the biggest differences that I see will either be in terms of breadth or depth. So there are some that I think, and much like the NVD even, where they focus on breadth, so maybe wide coverage, they're not necessarily focused on a particular subset of the industry or a particular piece of technology or programming language, but it's really any piece of software at all. So it's very, very wide, lots of quantity, though typically what I've seen from that is that quality can suffer, and it's really hard. And we struggle with this ourselves too, right? It's hard to raise the quality bar while maintaining the quantity bar. And that's usually the balance that we're trying to strive for. So we end up focusing a lot more, at least within my team, on depth. So we are much more narrowly scoped and narrowly focused than some of the other vulnerability databases out there. Again, we support a set number of ecosystems that are tied to open source package registries. And if it's on that registry, then we are supporting it. And if it's not, then we are not at this time. And that is really to keep us very tightly focused, because I'm managing a team of human beings that are reviewing all of this data that's coming in. So that's something that I see as a big difference across advisory databases too. Folks that are focused more on breadth and completeness will have a lot of automation in place, and typically maybe not humans reviewing it, or their quality bar might be a little bit different than ours. I have a team of human beings that are reviewing everything that goes into our review data set. So everything that is generating a Dependabot alert, an NPM audit alert, a NuGet audit alert, pick something, is reviewed by a human being. And in addition to that, because we are human beings, we're also very open to feedback on any of the advisories or vulnerability information that we're publishing as well. So we run another open source repository where we're actively taking feedback from the community, fixing something on advisory, fixing something that maybe we've missed and should be in our database, and my team has not gotten to it yet for one reason or another. So we're also very open about that, very open about all of the feedback that we're taking, why we're making certain decisions, why we're not making others, and sharing that information back with the community so they can better understand and have higher confidence and trust in us for what we're covering, why we're not covering other things, and where we fit in. So I view us as being, we are very specific. We are hyper-focused on open source, hyper-focused on our set number of ecosystems that we currently support, but none of that is stationary either or stagnant by any means. We're consistently looking for new pieces of vulnerability data that we could add to our advisories, to our database as a whole, new ecosystems that we can support, different ways to both grow and expand the database, but also while maintaining that very high quality bar that we're striving for.
Yeah, and a few things you said there jumped out to me is like just the breadth and scale of, the open source software ecosystem is more than enough to keep you all busy, to put it lightly. And the fact that you have humans involved in that process, given the scale of the challenge, is just, it speaks to the capabilities of the team and the unique position of GitHub in the ecosystem to even have the level of resources to do something like that. And then you also mentioned you talked about Log4Shell in the beginning. You talked about like just bringing awareness and transparency to folks about who may be impacted by something, or what they may have in their code base that they aren't aware of. I'm curious, like going back to Log4Shell and before that, it seems like despite the pervasive aspect of open source software, there's been a long stretch in our ecosystem as an industry where people just didn't really pay attention to quite so much about like what they had in their code base, and now we see attackers targeting those things. Why do you think the growth of open source, was so pervasive, but when it came to actually understanding what we're even running, it was like we were kind of late to oh yeah, asset inventory is kind of a thing that we should be thinking about. Like, why do you think it took us so long?
I think folks were thinking of it too surface level. It's I'm going to use this project, so maybe I know, and maybe I'm making a conscious decision to use this project, but there's so much happening maybe unconsciously when we're talking about transitive dependencies and transitive vulnerabilities that are really catching people by surprise, because I don't think that they were thinking of it in that way. So if we think of maybe a standard vendor type software provider, you have a contract with them, you make some agreement, some assertion, this is what I'm buying from you, this is the software that I'm using. When it comes to open source, that is almost never the case. It's typically that you're taking that, and maybe the maintainers don't even know that you're using it, right? Because it's provided, it's free, it's open. So those providing the software may not even be aware of who is using it, and who is using the software may not be aware of the depth that they really need to be going to understand their full attack surface. So I think it's taken us a while as an industry to be thinking about this in the right way, because it is not always the same, and even somewhat the opposite in some regards to using more traditional closed source software.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so not to push you too hard on this topic, I'm just curious, given your background in CERT and SEI and incident response and product security and now GitHub Advisory Database, it's interesting, like you said, we don't have SLAs, we don't have, agreements with the open source software ecosystem and these people that maintain and contribute and do all these great things. And I'm glad you called that out, because some people seem to think that they owe us something or something. That's not the case at all. In most cases, it's free to use as is. But commercial closed source proprietary software is often overwhelmingly made up of open source software components. Where do you stand, or what are your thoughts around COTS providers providing transparency to customers of what's actually in the product when it comes to open source software?
I think they should. And I think that this is a huge shift that we've seen over the last couple of years, especially with the pushes for SBOMs. Now, I don't necessarily think an SBOM is going to solve everything by any means, but I think knowing is half the battle and is probably a really good place to start. So I certainly don't think it would help or would hurt anybody to be developing their own, looking for those, asking those that they're buying software from for an SBOM, for a list of what are the things that I do need to care about, and to be thinking about that. And I think it's something that we should have long been doing, but it's something that we're really now over the past maybe 5 or 6 years coming to terms with as an industry. Like, you know what, we we do really need to do this, and we do really need to focus on this. So I think for me, it comes down to responsibility, um, and ethics almost. I end up having a lot of ethical type conversations when it comes to this, is who is responsible for doing this, and who is responsible for giving and taking, and in what capacity and what manner. So I think those consuming and using the software have a responsibility to engage with those that are providing the software to them in a positive fashion. And I think those providing the software do have an obligation, or should have an obligation, to provide, here's a list of everything that's in this software, so you as the user know that.
Yeah, I think many in the industry obviously agree with you. We're seeing the push for SBOMs. We're seeing, regulatory and compliance changes calling for these artifacts and transparency. But there's a give and take about, a roadmap for the attacker, or, a lack of, maybe incentives for providers to provide that transparency if they're not required to. And so it's a very complicated, almost an ethical conversation like you talked about. So yeah, I'm just curious where you stood on that. When you talk about like the open source software ecosystem more broadly, and cybersecurity and software supply chain attacks, we talked about transparency. You talked about raising awareness, for example. What are some other things you and or the team at your team at GitHub can think about? When we talk about software supply chain from the open source perspective, what are other things we can do? I know you guys have made some pushes around more secure authentication, for example, for open source software maintainers and contributors. What are some things that you and or the team, think that we need to be pushing for in addition to those?
Yeah, I think we need to be looking at the entire chain, right? Not just the piece of software that is produced at the end of the chain, but every single step that is a part of that, and baking in security as much as we realistically and possibly can into each one of those steps. So I think typical AppSec, at least of the past, has focused maybe more on the end deliverable, just the software that is shipped itself. But I think what we're seeing now is a huge push to focus on the entire chain, the entire SDLC, and every single part of it, with things like, package attestation. Yes, I am the one that had produced this. I promise you can trust me, right? Like those sort of things. 2FA at the registry level, at the developer level, at every single part. Um, Things like that, I think, is really where we're going, kind of where we're at now, but I think where we need to stay and continue pushing also.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to ask you a couple other questions. I know you talked about your community involvement. For example, you're also involved with the CVE team directly. Can you talk about that experience and what your role is over there and how that's been?
Yeah, absolutely. December of this past year, 2023, I was privileged enough to join the CVE board, which is the board of individuals determining the strategy and future and plans of the CVE program as a whole. So when I was working at CERT also runs a CVE naming authority, which is a special group of individuals who are given the privilege or permission to assign CVE IDs on behalf of their users, given a particular scope. So the first one I was a part of was while I was at CERT. The second one I was a part of was at the GitHub PCERT team. And my current team now is the third CNA that I've been a part of. So I've been engaging in these working groups and in this community for as long as I've been working professionally. And I'm personally very passionate about, instead of just complaining and pointing out all of the things that are wrong with the industry and wrong with the specifications that we're using and wrong with our processes, but actually going out there and fixing them. So my team is one of the biggest CVE numbering authorities in the world right now. We've assigned quite a lot. Open source maintainers love to use us, and we love to provide that service for them. But we are huge users of the system, both in assigning these IDs, but also consumers of the system, as in we're consuming all of the CVE data to generate our advisories in our database. So we sort of uniquely fit in both of those roles, and at a really high scale. So I think we have a responsibility ethically to be contributing back to that system and trying to fix the problems that we're seeing. Because of our scale, we also maybe see or feel a lot more of the friction points even than maybe some others that engage in this. So I think we have, again, a duty and a responsibility to give back. So myself and my team actively engage in a number of their working groups. We give feedback on the new rules, new specifications, changes in the program, issues that we're working on. We help guide and advise. They're also doing a lot of their development on GitHub. So we also try to help advise and guide in that way and let them know what features they have available to them, especially those that are free and can increase the security of what is already a security program as well. So we try to help and advise in that way. So by joining the board this past year, am hoping and continuing to do to bring some more of like an open source perspective to the board, and just bring a bit of a bit more of our community at that level, because broadly, that's what I see not happening nearly enough. Open source is viewed as like the open source. Well, there is no one open source, right? There's that is such a widely encompassing term. So when folks want to do better and better engage with a particular community, like I'm very happy that we started with me for sure, and not even started with me, right? There have been plenty of open source folks engaged in the CV community before myself even, but I also fully acknowledge that I'm not it either, right? I do not represent the whole community. I represent probably a small subset of it, if that, at this point, given how broad and how diverse our open source community is. So I want to see more of that. I want to see more engagement and more involvement from other key open source stakeholders, open source projects, folks that, the loud voices that are giving this sort of feedback to the program and to those in vulnerability management about here's where the issues are, here's what we need to fix. I'd love to see them in some of these groups with us and actually trying to fix these issues and modeling, maybe the behavior that they want to see, which is what I myself am personally trying to do and what my team is also trying to do by engaging with these communities that we're working with.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think it makes a lot of sense. And given the outsized role that open source software continues to play in like the modern digital landscape, I'm glad to hear that you and others like you have more involvement with programs like CVE. And not to confuse our audience who may not, live and breathe these acronyms like you and I and others, but, you talked about CNA, CVE. We talked about things like CVSS and EPSS, and like the acronyms keep coming. The latest one is ADP, I think it is, Authorized Data Provider, I want to say it stands for. If I'm right, let me know. And if not, let me know. But, what does that one mean exactly? And how does that play into the CVE and the scoring and the enrichment of vulnerability data and so on?
Absolutely. You're very close. It's an authorized data publisher, but in very high level terms, an authorized data publisher is somebody that the CVE program has given permission to provide feedback on a CVE record that they did not assign, that they are not the original assigner of, have not provided the original details to. So the the thought behind that is that there are others out there, even like myself, right? Like my team and my database that are actively curating and providing information on vulnerabilities affecting products that we are not the owners of, but we maybe have additional context, additional understanding, additional resources, references, you pick, that we can add to better curate and make the record itself more comprehensive. So that's a lot of the reasoning behind the ADP program, is to give folks a way to be able to provide that additional context to a CVE record. So again, it can be consumed in a machine readable fashion. So our first ADP is the CISA group from the US government. So they will be providing details back to CVE records that are missing those details specifically. So they're looking at CWE information. I'm going to throw out a bunch more acronyms so apologies to our listeners, but CWE information, CVSS, KEV, SSVC, and I think there might be missing a fifth. But their goal is to provide information back to a CVE record that is missing it, but specifically to a record that they themselves did not assign. So that's one of the big differences compared to the past.
Yeah, I think when you think about that, you talked about how GitHub has a process for the community to be able to contribute feedback, right, to vulnerability advisories and notifications and guidance. I think it's long overdue for CVE as a program to have a method for the industry and organizations to do the same. Maybe they weren't the CNA who provide the initial information, but they have some additional information that can be used to enrich the record, provide further clarification or guidance or insight. So I'm glad to see that happening. One other role you talked about that you have is with OpenSSF, I think it is, as the Vulnerability Disclosure Working Group Chair, if I got that right. If it is, can you let us know a little bit about what that group entails and what you're up to over there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the OpenSSF is the Open Source Security Foundation. Within that foundation are a number of working groups focused on improving different parts of security within our broad open source landscape. So I co-chair the Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group, which is focused on vulnerability disclosure in the open source community, the different issues that we run into and how we can better address them. So my working group provides a lot of guidance to the community. We have developed a number of comprehensive guides, both for maintainers and for security researchers reporting vulnerabilities to maintainers, on how they can coordinate vulnerabilities, how they can set their project up for success. especially when we're talking about vulnerability management and incident response, where they can go for feedback or resources. We have whole sections on if you need a CVE ID, here are all the different places that you can go and get them and why you might be doing that and why this person or this person. So we try to develop a lot of broad guidance and share that publicly with the community. And we're also available for more specific guidance if folks are running into issues that they might need help with. They're welcome to come to our working group, ask for advice, ask for help. We're happy to do that. But yeah, generally providing vulnerability disclosure guidance to the broad open source community.
Very cool. And I dropped a link to that in the show notes here. So I mean, we've run the gamut from OpenSSF to the CVE program to the GitHub Advisory Database. As we wrap this up, I have a question I ask everyone is, what does the term cyber resiliency mean to you?
Ooh, that is a good question. So if I think cyber resiliency, and I'll maybe even go a step further and think of it specifically in terms of security, because that's my background and my expertise. It's not keeping yourself from suffering from a vulnerability, suffering from a breach, or suffering from something like that. It is, to me, resiliency is, we know that's going to happen. It's how do you handle that and how do you bounce back from that and how do you keep yourself, your users, your stakeholders protected in that process and have it so it doesn't burn out everybody in the process either. You don't want to burn out your engineers, your incident responders, especially if you're talking about like an open source project where many of them are volunteer based as well. So to me, resiliency is not so much that I can handle this security issue in a one-off, but it's that I'm set up so I can continue doing this and that this isn't going to take down my whole product, my whole platform, or anything that I've developed up to that point, but something repeatable. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I love the answer. It's not, like you said, one-off. It's a repeatable process, a pattern, a behavior, a capability, right? To, withstand what comes your way. So well said. For folks, looking to follow you more, learn more about what you're up to at the GitHub Advisory Database, CVE, OpenSSF, where can folks follow you and learn more? And, do you have any events or any talking, coming up they might want to check out?
Oh, that's such a fantastic question. I actually just finished quite a large bout of travel, so I don't have any upcoming talks planned. I am intending to go to DEF CON later this year, so you might catch me at Hacker Summer Camp in person if anybody would like to say hello. Folks are also welcome to follow or connect with me on LinkedIn. My Twitter and Mastodon are still active, though I wouldn't say I am the most active on them. And of course, I am quite active on GitHub if anybody needs anything as well. And my contact details are all on my GitHub user profile as well. My email address, folks are welcome to reach out to me in whatever way makes sense for them. I'm on Signal, Keybase, all the usual suspects.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Madison. We covered quite the breadth of topics. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. I hope you all have a good afternoon and a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.